But Dr. Bandura, one of the most challenging concepts with which you have dealt is, of course, self-efficacy. Here you appear to be examining the potential for self-regulation or self-determination of the human being as you analyze the components of effective functioning.
Well, effective functioning requires that people develop competencies and skills. And in addition to that, they need a strong self-belief of their own efficacy to put those skills to good use. So our views of ability and competence are changing. We used to conceptualize them very heavily in terms of these are the fixed things we have built in. And it's quite evident from the efficacy research that people with the same skills can perform poorly, adequately, or extraordinarily, depending on how they orchestrate these skills. That skills are a generative capability, and efficacy plays a critical role in whether these are orchestrated well, poorly, or extraordinarily. So my interest in this area was to what are the ways in which people's self-beliefs of their capabilities to exercise some control over events that affect their lives, how does that translate into human accomplishments, motivation, and human distress? And so we've been able to identify several different ways in which that translation occurs. People's beliefs in their efficacy has a powerful effect on their choice behavior. Namely, we choose to engage in things that we believe that we'll be able to master, and we tend to avoid activities and situations that we believe exceed our coping capabilities. And anything that can affect choice behavior can have a profound effect on our life paths, and because that determines which potentialities we cultivate and which remain undeveloped. And the second important effect is in terms of its powerful effect in motivation. That if a high sense of efficacy leads people to mobilize a high level of effort in their activity, and they tend to be much more perseverant in the face of obstacles and difficulties. And so the second translation is its impact on motivation. The third effect has to do with how self-efficacy affects our thinking processes. Our thinking processes, when we're encountering problems and obstacles, are they self-aiding or are they self-hindering? And so people who have a high sense of efficacy tend to devote their attention and cognitive resources to mastering the problem that they're dealing with, whereas people who are plagued by self-doubts about their efficacy tend to worry more about the many things that are going to go wrong. And if you're running off failure scenarios, you certainly are increasing the probability that you'll have difficulties, as opposed to whether or not you're running off success scenarios in your thinking patterns as you're coping. And then the other way in which efficacy affects our psychological welfare and functioning is by its effects on our vulnerability to stress and depression. People have a low sense of efficacy, are much more vulnerable to experience stress in coping situations, and they're more vulnerable to depression. Now, in the area of the arts, the rule that repeated rejection is the rule rather than the exception is also graphically revealed. The Impressionists couldn't get any of their artwork shown in the Paris Salon. They finally set up their own competitive shows. Early in his career, an art dealer would not allow Picasso to bring in his pictures in from out of the rain. Van Gogh sold only one piece during his lifetime. And the rejection list goes on. In our own field, it's not unusual for scientific classics to suffer repeated rejection. And the striking case is John Garcia, whose contributions are now well recognized, but early in his career, his manuscripts were consistently rejected because what he was showing did not conform to what the common belief was concerning conditioning processes. Now, it's bad enough to get your manuscripts rejected, but when these come with hostile embellishments, it's even more difficult to take. I think the message is that people shouldn't be too quick to attribute rejection to personal failings, because to do so might be self-limiting.
In conclusion, I have found particularly intriguing to hear from the distinguished participants of this series what their plans for their future work are. What are you planning to work on at this point, Dr. Bandura?
Well, it goes with the cosmic title, Social Foundations of Thought and Action, in which I've tried to address sort of broader issues as to how does our theory and knowledge of psychology, how does that begin to address the more basic social functions, how does it begin to address the way in which our institutions are operating and so on. So it's concerned not only with different subspecialties of psychology, but then you draw knowledge across specialties, so you get into, if we're talking about vicarious influence, that's a basic assumption of legal deterrence theory. So you need to get into legal deterrence systems, and how do they correspond to what we know about vicarious influence. You get into political systems, economic systems, and now, when you start out with this kind of book, if you had that scope in mind at the beginning, you'd never embark on that, because it would require a high level of lunacy and self-inflicted punishment. But if you do it in graduated steps, you eventually get there.
Al, this discussion with you has just been delightful. Your enthusiasm is simply marvelous. Thank you so much for your cooperation in this project.
Thank you very, very much.